The stranger's eyes were darker than the storm gathering over the peaks, and Elena knew that whatever he was about to say would change everything. Her father was dying in the next room, her younger siblings crying from hunger she couldn't fix, and this man, this dangerous man the whole town whispered about, sat at her splintered table like he owned it. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than wind through winter pines. "I'll clear every debt your family owes. I'll keep you fed through spring." He paused, and the silence crushed her lungs. "All I need is you, H." Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The cabin door rattled against its leather hinges, and Elena pressed her weight against it, fighting the wind that screamed down from the high country. February in the Colorado Rockies didn't forgive weakness, and tonight the storm had teeth. "Elena," her sister Rosie's voice cut through the howl. "Papa's asking for water again." Elena's hands were already raw from hauling firewood, but she moved anyway, crossing the single room that held everything left of their lives. The water bucket sat near the stove, a skin of ice forming at the edges despite the struggling fire. She cracked it with her knuckle and filled the tin cup, trying not to think about how light the bucket felt, how few trips to the frozen creek it represented. Their father lay on the only real bed, a construction of rope and pine that predated Elena's birth. Thomas Mercer had been a big man once, the kind who could swing a pickaxe from dawn until dark and still have strength left to toss his daughters in the air. Now he was just angles beneath a threadbare quilt, his breathing wet and labored. "Here, Papa." Elena lifted his head gently, angling the cup. He managed 2 swallows before waving it away. His eyes, once sharp as new minted coins, were clouded with the particular exhaustion of a body ready to quit. "The mine? Nothing today." The lie came easier than it should have. She'd stopped checking the claim 2 weeks ago, when the last support timber cracked. The shaft was a tomb waiting to happen, but her father didn't need to know that his 30 years of breaking rock had bought them nothing but this, a failing cabin and debts that multiplied like rats in grain. "Tomorrow, then." His voice faded to something barely there. "Tomorrow, we'll hit the vein." "Sure, Papa, tomorrow." Behind her, Rosie shifted near the stove where their youngest brother Samuel huddled under a coat 3 sizes too large. The boy was 9 and hadn't complained once about eating nothing but weak potato soup for 6 days straight, which somehow made it worse. Children should complain, should demand, should be loud and difficult, and alive in ways that required more food than she could provide. Elena moved to the shelf that held their supplies. 2 potatoes sat in the wooden crate, both soft with frost damage. A 1/4 sack of cornmeal, salt. That was it. That was everything standing between her family and the kind of hunger that killed people in slow increments. "We could ask Mrs. Henderson," Rosie started. "No." Elena's voice came out harder than she meant. "We're not begging. We're already begging." Rosie was 14 and had inherited their mother's bluntness along with her dark hair. Asking neighbors is just begging with extra steps. Elena wanted to argue, but the truth sat too heavy in her chest. They were begging, had been for months. The Hendersons had given them half a smoked ham in December. The Yakamuras brought rice and dried fish when they could spare it. Even old man Pritchard, who hated everyone equally, had left firewood by their door 3 times without saying a word. The town of Silver Peak wasn't rich, mining camps never were. But people helped when they could. Except helping had limits, and Elena could feel they'd reached theirs. Everyone was preparing for the late winter push, hoarding supplies for the hard weeks before thaw. Nobody had extra anything, and she wouldn't take from families with their own children to feed. "I could go to the camp," Rosie's voice dropped to barely audible. "Wilson's logging outfit is hiring for—" "Don't!" Elena spun, and her sister flinched. "Don't even finish that sentence." They both knew what Wilson's camp hired young women for, and it had nothing to do with logging. Elena had seen girls go into those camps, had seen some of them come out different, hollowed in ways that had nothing to do with hunger. "I'm just saying we have options, not that option, never that." The wind hit the cabin again, and somewhere in the roof structure something creaked with the particular sound of wood on the edge of failing. Elena added it to the mental list of things she couldn't fix, couldn't afford to fix, couldn't even think about fixing without wanting to scream into the void of her father's wasted dreams. He'd come west 28 years ago, chasing gold fever and promises. Met their mother in a Denver boarding house. She'd been running from something too, though she never said what. They'd married fast and moved to the mountains where Thomas was certain his fortune waited in the rock. Their mother had given them 3 children and died bringing the 4th, a son who lived just 3 days. That was 6 years back, and Thomas had never recovered. Started taking risks underground. Started following veins that pinched to nothing. Started borrowing money from the wrong people because he was sure, absolutely certain, that the next shaft would pay everything back triple. Now they owed money to half the territory. The general store in Silver Peak, a mining equipment supplier in Denver. 2 different loan offices with interest rates that would make a banker blush. And worst of all, they owed Marcus Hendren. Hendren ran the largest operation in the district. Not mining, but lending. He funded prospectors and took claims when they failed, slowly accumulating property rights across the mountains. He was patient, polite, and absolutely ruthless about collecting debts. In 4 weeks, his patience would end, and the Mercer family would lose everything: the cabin, the claim, even the few pieces of furniture that had belonged to their mother. Elena had considered every option. Selling the claim outright, but without her father's signature, which he'd never give, she couldn't touch it. Finding work in town, except every job was filled, and nobody needed another unskilled hand. Writing to her mother's family back east, except her mother had been escaping them, and Elena had nothing but a single name and a city she wasn't even sure was right. She was 22 years old, responsible for a dying father and 2 children, and she had run completely out of moves. The knock on the door came so suddenly that Elena gasped. Nobody visited in storms. Nobody sane, anyway. Silver Peak might be rough, but people respected the weather. Traveling in this wind was asking to freeze before you reached wherever you were going. Samuel looked up with wide eyes. Rosie moved closer to their father's bed. Elena grabbed the iron poker from beside the stove and approached the door. "Who is it?" No answer, just another knock, measured and deliberate. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Stories ran through her head, tales that circulated through mining camps about drifters and deserters, about men the wilderness had changed into something not quite human anymore. She'd always dismissed them as the kind of nonsense people told around fires to make themselves feel dangerous. Tonight, with the wind screaming murder and something unknown on the other side of their flimsy door, those stories felt less like nonsense. "I'm armed," she called out, which was technically true if you counted the poker. "I know." The voice was male, deep, and utterly calm, despite the storm trying to tear the world apart. "I'm looking for Thomas Mercer, his daughter Elena specifically." The use of her name froze her completely. Not a daughter, not the family. Her name. Rosie made a small noise of fear. Samuel had gone completely still in that way children did when they sensed adult terror. Elena's options cycled through her mind in half a second. Refuse to open the door and wait to see if he forced it. Open it and face whatever came, claim to be someone else, and hope he left. None of them were good. All of them assumed she had any control over the situation, which was probably a lie she was telling herself. She opened the door. The man on her threshold was tall, well over 6 feet, and built with the kind of lean strength that came from constant physical work rather than any attempt at appearance. His coat was dark wool, well made, but worn in ways that spoke of real use. Ice had formed in his dark beard, and his eyes. His eyes were the coldest thing about him, and that was saying something in a February storm. Not cruel, not warm either, just assessing, like he was tallying everything he saw and calculating value. "Elena Mercer?" He didn't wait for confirmation. "I need to speak with you and your father. May I come in?" The audacity of asking permission while clearly planning to enter regardless almost made her laugh. Almost. Instead, she stepped aside because the wind was stealing what little heat the cabin had, and because something about him suggested refusing would just delay the inevitable. He entered with economical movements, closing the door behind him with one hand while his eyes swept the room. Elena watched him catalog everything: the dying man in the bed, the frightened children by the stove, the near-empty shelves, the general air of a family on the edge of collapse. His expression didn't change, didn't show pity or satisfaction or anything remotely readable. "Thomas Mercer?" He addressed the bed directly. Their father had managed to prop himself on one elbow, suspicion fighting through the fog of illness. "Who's asking?" "Silas Granger." He pulled off his hat, shaking ice from the brim. "I have a business proposition for your family." "We don't have business," Elena said flatly. "We have debts and a played-out claim. If you're collecting for someone, I'm not collecting." He turned those measuring eyes on her. "I'm offering." Thomas started to speak, but it turned into coughing that rattled his whole frame. Rosie moved to help him, and Silas Granger's gaze tracked her movement before returning to Elena. "Your family owes approximately $1,400 across various creditors," he said, and Elena's stomach dropped because that number was exactly right down to the dollar. "Marcus Hendren holds the majority of that debt and will begin foreclosure proceedings in approximately 4 weeks. How, Elena started. How I know isn't relevant. What matters is I'm prepared to settle all outstanding debts immediately. Additionally, I'll provide enough money to sustain your family comfortably through spring and into summer." The cabin had gone silent except for the wind and Thomas's labored breathing. Elena felt Rosie's stare burning into her back. Even Samuel had perked up, childlike hope flickering across his thin face. "Nobody does that," Elena said carefully. "Nobody pays strangers' debts from kindness." "I didn't mention kindness." Something that might have been amusement flickered across Silas's face. "I said I have a proposition." "What do you want?" Thomas managed to rasp out. "The claim?" "No, your claim is worthless. You know that, even if you won't say it." Silas turned his attention fully to Elena, and she felt the weight of it like a physical thing. "I want your daughter." The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of meaning spreading in directions Elena couldn't quite track fast enough. "Excuse me?" Her voice came out strangled. "Marriage, legal, binding, and immediate." He said it the way someone might discuss purchasing supplies. "In exchange, I'll clear your debts, provide for your family, and ensure they're protected through the remainder of the winter." "You're insane!" The words burst out before Elena could stop them. Practical, actually. He didn't seem offended. "You need money. I need a wife. This resolves both problems efficiently." "Why?" Rosie spoke up from beside their father's bed. "Why her? Why not, I don't know, any other woman who might actually want to marry you?" "That's exactly why." Silas looked at Rosie with what might have been respect. "Women who want to marry me want something I'm unwilling to give. Elena needs something I can provide, which makes the transaction considerably clearer." "I'm not a transaction." Elena's hands had balled into fists. "I'm a person. I'm aware. That's why I'm asking instead of simply purchasing your family's debts and foreclosing myself." He turned his hat in his hands, ice melt dripping onto their floor. "I'm also offering you the option to refuse, though I suspect we both know you won't." The casual certainty in his voice made her want to hit him, made her want to scream, made her want to do anything except stand there feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. Because he was right. She wouldn't refuse. Couldn't refuse. $1,400. Food for her family. Protection through a winter that was actively trying to kill them. All she had to do was marry a complete stranger who looked at her like she was a problem to solve rather than a human being. "Elena, no!" Thomas had found his voice, thin but determined. "You're not. We'll find another way." "What other way, Papa?" She didn't turn to look at him because she knew what she'd see. A dying man trying to protect his daughter from the consequences of his own failures. She loved him too much to let him watch her make this choice. "Tell me what other way exists that doesn't end with Rosie and Samuel starving or worse." Thomas had no answer. They both knew it. Elena studied Silas Granger with the same calculating coldness he'd shown her. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she guessed. Handsome in a harsh way, if you liked your men rough and potentially dangerous. The town rumors about him flickered through her memory. The dangerous drifter who lived somewhere in the high country. The man nobody really knew. The one people whispered about in the general store when they thought children weren't listening. "I've heard stories about you," she said. "They say you're dangerous. They're not wrong. They say you're hiding something in the mountains. Also not wrong. And you expect me to just, what, leave with you? Trust you?" "No." He met her eyes dead on. "I expect you to make the best choice available from a collection of terrible options. Trust doesn't enter into it. The honesty was somehow worse than if he'd lied. Worse than if he'd tried to charm her or make promises about love growing or any of the garbage she'd read in the few novels that had made it to Silver Peak. This was what her life had been reduced to, a business transaction with a stranger who was at least honest about what he wanted. What exactly would this marriage entail, she asked, and hated how steady her voice sounded. You would come with me to my property, live there as my wife. He paused, and something flickered in those cold eyes. I won't force anything on you that you don't consent to. You'll have your own space, your own autonomy within reason. I need a wife for legal purposes, not a slave. Legal purposes? Elena laughed, and it came out bitter. What legal purposes require a wife you don't even want? That's my business. If I'm going to marry you, it becomes my business too. Fair. He considered her for a long moment. There are inheritance issues I'd rather not discuss in detail. Having a wife resolves certain complications. That's all you need to know for now. For now, as if there would be later conversations, as if this was the beginning of something rather than just a contract written in desperation and cold calculation. Elena looked at her father, still propped up in bed, his face a mask of guilt and helplessness. At Rosie, who was trying so hard to be brave that it physically hurt to witness. At Samuel, who was 9 years old and shouldn't have to understand adult compromises, but clearly did anyway. If I agree, she said slowly, my family gets the money immediately? The debts are cleared before I leave? Yes, and they'll have enough to make it through until Papa can... She caught herself. Until they can figure out next steps? More than enough. I'll also arrange for medical care for your father and ensure the cabin is weatherproofed properly. It was too much, too generous for what he claimed to want. Every instinct Elena had screamed that she was missing something, that this bargain had teeth she couldn't see yet, but her family was dying by inches, and she was the only thing standing between them and the kind of poverty that destroyed people beyond recovery. I need time to think. No. Silas cut her off. The offer expires when I walk out that door. You decide now, or you gamble on finding another solution in the next 4 weeks. That's not fair. Life rarely is. He wasn't cruel about it, just factual. I need an answer, Elena. She wanted to hate him for the pressure, for standing there calm as stone while her entire world compressed into a single impossible choice, for being right about the fact that she had no real options, no time, no leverage whatsoever. But hate required energy she didn't have. If I say yes, she whispered, when would we leave? Tomorrow morning. The storm will break by dawn and the pass will be navigable for another few days before the next system moves in. Tomorrow? Rosie's voice cracked. You can't expect her to leave tomorrow. I can and do. Silas looked at Rosie with something that might have been sympathy, though it was hard to tell under the general coldness of his demeanor. Waiting only makes it harder. Better to move quickly. He was probably right about that too, which made Elena hate him just a little after all. She thought about her mother, who had run from something all those years ago and found a different kind of trap in these mountains. Thought about all the times she'd promised herself she'd be different, make better choices, have an actual life instead of just survival. This was the choice on offer, survival bought with herself as the price. My family gets everything you promised, she said, in writing, legally documented before we leave. Agreed. And if you're lying, if this is some kind of trick, then you'll be no worse off than you are right now, and your family will still have the money. He pulled a leather wallet from inside his coat and withdrew papers. I had the contracts drawn up already. You can review them. Of course he had. Of course he'd been that certain she'd agree. Elena took the papers with numb fingers and moved closer to the lamp. The legal language was dense, but the terms were clear enough. Marriage between Silas Granger and Elena Mercer. Payment of all debts listed by creditor and amount. Provision of $500 for family maintenance. Arrangement for medical care for Thomas Mercer. All of it dependent on the marriage being legally formalized within 24 hours. There was a clause about annulment that she didn't fully understand, and another about property rights that seemed unusually specific, but nothing that screamed obvious trap to her admittedly limited legal knowledge. I want Rosie to read this too, Elena said. Silas nodded. Of course. Her sister moved to her side, and they went through the contract together while Silas stood silent and Thomas struggled to breathe in a way that made Elena's heart crack. Samuel had fallen asleep by the stove, exhausted by hunger and fear. "It looks legitimate," Rosie whispered. "I mean, I think it does. But Elena, you can't—" "Yeah, I can." Elena folded the papers carefully. "I can, and I'm going to. There has to be another way. Show me." Elena heard the exhaustion in her own voice. "Show me one other way that doesn't end with all of us destroyed." Rosie had tears running down her face now, silent and devastating. "I could—" "No, you couldn't. You're 14. Elena pulled her sister into a fierce hug. "You're going to stay here with Papa and Samuel. You're going to use the money to get him medical help. And when spring comes, you're going to figure out what comes next. But you're not sacrificing yourself. That's not happening. Neither should you. What's us?" "I'm older. It's my job." Elena pulled back and tried to smile, though she had no idea if she managed it. Besides, maybe it won't be terrible. Maybe he's just eccentric. Rich people are eccentric, right? "I'm not rich," Silas said mildly. "I'm comfortable." Both sisters jumped. They'd almost forgotten he was there, which seemed impossible given that he dominated the small space just by existing in it. Elena turned to face him, decision crystallizing in her chest like ice forming on still water. "I want one more thing." "Name it." "If I do this, if I marry you and go wherever you're taking me, and it turns out you've lied about any of it, I want the right to walk away. No questions, no consequences for my family." "You have that right regardless. I'm not interested in keeping you prisoner." He paused. "Though I'd appreciate reasonable notice rather than just disappearing in the night." The fact that he felt the need to specify that suggested he'd considered the possibility of her running. Filed that away under things to remember about Silas Granger. "Fine." Elena drew in a breath that felt like swallowing glass. "Then, yes, I'll marry you." Thomas made a sound like something breaking. "Elena, please." "It's done, Papa." She went to his bedside and took his hand, feeling how fragile the bones had become. "It's the right choice, the only choice. Your mother would never forgive me. Mama would understand." Elena wasn't sure if that was true, but she needed it to be. She'd want us to survive. Her father's tears were silent, and Elena couldn't look at them directly without falling apart herself. Instead, she focused on the practicalities because that's what you did when the world was ending. You figured out the next step, and then the one after that, and you didn't think about what you were losing along the way. "We'll need to get to town in the morning," she said to Silas, "for the legal part. Already arranged, Judge Carmichael will meet us at his office at 8. Silas moved toward the door. "I'll be back at dawn with a horse for you and a wagon for your family's supplies." "Supplies?" "I'm having food and medical provisions delivered to the cabin tonight. Your father will have what he needs." He pulled his hat back on. "Pack light. We have a long ride ahead of us." Then he was gone, disappearing into the storm like he'd never been there at all. Elena stood in the sudden silence, listening to her father cry and her sister try not to, and wondered what exactly she'd just agreed to. The answer came with the kind of clarity that felt like drowning. She'd agreed to whatever it took. Dawn came with the peculiar silence that followed storms, the world muffled under fresh snow and the sky that too bright blue that promised brutal cold. Elena had slept maybe an hour total, lying beside Rosie in the bed they'd shared since their mother died, staring at the ceiling boards and trying not to think about what came next. When she heard the horses outside, she was already dressed in her best dress, which wasn't saying much, just a wool thing her mother had made years ago. Mended so many times the original fabric was mostly memory. She'd packed a single bag, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's Bible even though she rarely opened it, a daguerreotype of the family from before Samuel was born, and the carved wooden bird her father had made her when she was 7. Everything else, the life she'd built in this cabin, the memories that soaked into the walls, the dreams she'd barely let herself acknowledge, had to stay behind. Silas was punctual. She'd give him that. The wagon he'd brought was loaded with crates that made Thomas's eyes go wide. Food, medicine, blankets, lamp oil, things they hadn't been able to afford in months. A man Elena didn't recognize was already unloading them, efficient and silent. "Ready?" Silas asked from horseback. No, not even remotely. "Yes." The ride into Silver Peak took 2 hours through snow that would have been beautiful if Elena had any capacity left for noticing beauty. Silas rode ahead, and she followed on a gray mare that seemed too well trained for a man who was supposedly just a drifter. Rosie and Samuel came in the wagon driven by Silas's silent helper, Thomas wrapped in more blankets than he'd probably seen in his entire life. Judge Carmichael was waiting at his office above the general store, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The ceremony took maybe 5 minutes, vows that meant nothing, signatures that meant everything, and suddenly Elena was married to a man whose last name she'd learned approximately 12 hours ago. "Congratulations," the judge said, and didn't mean it even slightly. Silas handed over a bank draft to Thomas, the money for debts and maintenance, all official and legal. Then another envelope with cash that he pressed into Rosie's hands. "For anything unexpected," he said quietly. "You'll need it." Her sister took it with shaking hands, and Elena saw the moment Rosie realized this was actually happening. That her older sister was actually leaving with this stranger, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. The goodbyes were terrible. Samuel clung to her until Silas gently but firmly pulled him away. Thomas tried to speak and couldn't, just held her hand like if he gripped hard enough, she'd stay. And Rosie, "If he hurts you," Rosie whispered, "I'll find a way to kill him. I swear it." "He won't." Elena had no idea if that was true. "I'll still kill him if he does." Elena almost laughed. "Almost. I love you. Take care of them." "I love you too. Come back if you can." The conditional hurt worse than a definite farewell would have. Then Silas was helping her onto the horse. She noted he didn't try to put her on a side saddle, just let her ride astride like she'd been doing since childhood, and they were leaving Silver Peak behind. The pass climbed through country Elena had never seen, up beyond where the mining claims stopped, and into wilderness that felt older than human concern. Silas set a steady pace, not pushing, but not dawdling either, and the silence between them stretched for hours. Around midday, they stopped at a frozen creek to water the horses. Elena's legs ached from riding, and her hands were numb despite gloves. "There's food in your saddlebag," Silas said, not looking at her. "You should eat." She found bread, cheese, and dried meat, luxuries, and ate mechanically while Silas checked the horse's hooves and scanned the ridgeline like he expected trouble. "How much farther?" she asked finally. "We'll make it by nightfall if the weather holds." "Make it where?" "You'll see." The non-answer irritated her, but she was too tired to push. Besides, what difference did it make? She was already committed to this insanity. They rode on. The landscape grew stranger as they climbed. Rock formations that looked carved by deliberate hands, valleys that dropped away into nothing, stands of pines so thick they blocked the sun. This wasn't mining country. This wasn't any kind of country Elena recognized. Somewhere around late afternoon, they crossed a narrow pass between two peaks that felt like passing through a doorway. The air changed. The light changed. Even the quality of the silence felt different, heavier somehow. "What is this place?" Elena's voice came out hushed without her meaning it to. "The boundary," Silas said. "Past this point, the land is private, has been for 50 years. Private? All of it? All of it. That was impossible. Nobody owned entire mountain ranges, except apparently someone did, and she was married to him now, and that thought sat in her stomach like a stone. The trail descended into a valley that opened gradually, revealing itself in sections. First just trees and rock, then cleared meadows under snow, then... Elena pulled her horse to a stop. Below them, spread across the valley floor like something from a fever dream, was a settlement. Not a mining camp, not a town, something else entirely. Timber buildings arranged in deliberate clusters, smoke rising from chimneys, fences defining pastures where horses moved in the fading light. And dominating it all, built into the valley's eastern edge, was a house. No, a manor. 3 stories of dark wood and stone, with wide windows that caught the sunset and turned it to flame. "What is this?" Elena whispered. "Blackthorn Ridge." Silas's voice carried something she couldn't identify. Pride, maybe. Or warning. Home. The descent into the valley took another hour, and with every switchback, Elena's sense of reality bent further. This wasn't possible. Men like Silas, drifters who showed up in mountain towns during storms, didn't own places like this, didn't have timber estates that sprawled across valleys like small kingdoms. didn't live in houses that looked like they'd been transplanted from some eastern city's wealthy district. Yet here it was, getting larger and more impossible with each step the horses took. Workers paused in their tasks as they passed, and Elena felt their stares like physical weight. A woman carrying water stopped mid-stride. Two men repairing a fence straightened to watch. None of them looked hostile exactly, just surprised in a way that suggested Silas bringing home a wife was not something anyone had expected. He ignored them all, guiding his horse toward the main house with the kind of ease that spoke of long familiarity. Elena followed because she had no other choice, her mind still trying to reconcile the rough stranger from her cabin with the man who apparently owned all of this. They stopped in front of the house, manor, estate, whatever the hell you called a building this size, and Silas dismounted smoothly. Elena managed to get off her horse without falling, though her legs protested violently. She'd been riding for hours, and every muscle she owned was screaming. "Someone will take care of your horse," Silas said, already heading for the wide front steps. "Come inside." Elena wanted to snap at his tone. She wasn't a dog to be ordered around, but exhaustion had her by the throat. She followed him up the steps and through doors that were solid oak and carved with patterns that probably cost more than her family's entire cabin. The interior punched her in the chest. High ceilings, a staircase that curved upward with a banister of polished wood, floors that gleamed even in the fading light, furniture that looked like it belonged in photographs of rich people's houses, not in the Colorado wilderness. A woman appeared from a side hallway, older, with gray hair pulled back severely and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. Her eyes swept over Elena once, cataloging and dismissing in the same glance. "Mrs. Chen," Silas said, "this is Elena, my wife." Mrs. Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I see. Welcome to Blackthorn Ridge, Mrs. Granger." Mrs. Granger. The name sat wrong, like clothing that didn't fit properly. "Thank you," Elena managed. "She'll need a room prepared," Silas continued. "The blue guest room should work. And dinner in an hour." "Of course." Mrs. Chen turned that assessing gaze back to Elena. "If you'll follow me, I'll show you where you'll be staying." Elena glanced at Silas, who was already moving away toward another part of the house like he'd completed a task and moved on to the next one. Apparently this was how her marriage would function. Transactions and arrangements, courtesy without warmth. She followed Mrs. Chen up the staircase, down a hallway lined with paintings that probably had histories she'd never learn, and into a room that made her stop in the doorway. It was larger than the entire cabin she'd left that morning. A bed dominated one wall, an actual bed with a frame and what looked like a real mattress, not rope and straw. Windows looked out over the valley, now darkening as sunset bled away. A wardrobe stood against another wall, and a door led to what appeared to be a private washing room. "Your things can go in the wardrobe," Mrs. Chen said. "Though you'll need more clothing, I'll have measurements taken tomorrow." "I don't need—" Elena started. "You do." The older woman's tone allowed no argument. "Dinner is at 7. Someone will fetch you." Then she was gone, and Elena was alone in a room larger than any space she'd ever called her own, in a house that shouldn't exist, married to a man who'd turned out to be someone completely different from what he'd appeared. She sat on the edge of the bed, which was softer than anything she'd ever touched, and tried to process what had just happened to her life. The bag she'd brought sat on the floor, pathetic in its smallness, everything she owned in one worn canvas sack. She thought about unpacking but couldn't find the energy. Instead, she moved to the window and looked out at Blackthorn Ridge as darkness settled over it. Lights appeared in windows across the valley. She counted at least 20 separate buildings, maybe more. This wasn't just a house in the wilderness. This was the entire operation, a self-contained world that existed beyond the reach of towns like Silver Peak. And Silas owned it, ran it, which meant the man who'd sat at her splintered table looking like a rough drifter had been performing, disguising himself. Lying, essentially, about everything except his name. The anger that rose in Elena's chest was sharp and welcome. Better than the numbness. Better than the fear she'd been swallowing since last night. He'd lied. Maybe not directly, but by omission, which amounted to the same thing. He'd let her think he was one kind of man while being something entirely different, and she'd agreed to marry him without knowing who he actually was. A knock on the door interrupted her spiral. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Chen. Instead, a young woman entered, maybe Elena's age, with dark hair braided down her back and an expression that managed to be both curious and cautious. She carried a tray with food. "Mrs. Chen thought you might want dinner here tonight," she said, "since you're probably tired from traveling. I'm Marie, by the way. I work in the kitchens mostly." Elena's stomach chose that moment to remind her she'd eaten nothing but bread and cheese since dawn. "Thank you. You can set it on the table." Marie did, then hesitated. "Can I ask, is it true? You're really his wife?" "Apparently." Elena moved to the table and looked at the food. Roasted meat, actual vegetables, bread that looked fresh. Her mouth watered traitorously. "Nobody knew he was getting married. He just left 3 days ago and came back with you." Marie's curiosity was winning over her caution. "Where did you meet him?" "Silver Peak. He showed up at my family's cabin during the storm." "And you just agreed to marry him?" Elena picked up a fork, stabbing a piece of meat harder than necessary. "It's complicated." "Right. Sorry, I shouldn't pry." Marie backed toward the door. "If you need anything, just ring the bell by the bed. Someone will come." She left quickly, and Elena ate alone, tasting nothing despite the fact that the food was probably the best she'd ever had. The meat was tender, seasoned with things she couldn't identify. The vegetables weren't frozen or frost-damaged. The bread was soft inside, crusty outside, still warm. It was perfect, and she hated it. After eating, she finally unpacked her single bag, hanging her spare dress in the massive wardrobe where it looked ridiculous and small. The wooden bird went on the bedside table. The daguerreotype stayed in the bag because she couldn't look at her family's faces right now without breaking. Someone had filled the washing room with hot water, actually hot, steaming in a copper tub that was bigger than anything Elena had seen outside of hotels she'd never been able to afford. She bathed quickly, uncomfortable with the luxury, then dressed in her nightgown and climbed into the bed. It was too soft, too warm, too much of everything she'd never had and didn't know how to process. She lay awake for hours, listening to the house settle around her and wondering what exactly she'd traded herself for. Morning came with weak sunlight through windows she'd forgotten to cover. Elena woke disoriented, not recognizing the room or the bed or the quality of light, and for a horrible moment thought she was still dreaming. Then memory crashed back, and she sat up fast enough to make her head spin. Blackthorn Ridge, marriage, Silas's lies by omission. A knock sounded before she could spiral further. "Come in." Mrs. Chen entered with another tray, breakfast this time, and a dress draped over her arm. "Good morning, Mrs. Granger. I took the liberty of finding something appropriate for you to wear today. Your own clothes need mending." Elena looked at her wool dress from yesterday, now hanging over a chair. It did need mending. It had needed mending for months, but there had never been time or thread or energy to care. "I can wear what I have," she said. "You can, but you shouldn't." Mrs. Chen laid the new dress across the bed. "Mr. Granger wants you to tour the property this morning. You'll need appropriate attire." "Where is he?" "Already working. He's been up since dawn." The older woman moved to the windows, opening curtains Elena hadn't noticed in the dark. "He works early, always has. You'll get used to his schedule." Elena doubted that, but didn't argue. She ate breakfast while Mrs. Chen busied herself with things that didn't need doing, straightening already straight items, adjusting curtains that hung perfectly fine. It felt like supervision disguised as housekeeping. The dress Mrs. Chen had brought was simple but well made. Dark green wool with none of the worn patches or careful mends Elena was used to. It fit reasonably well, though it was slightly too large in the shoulders. "We'll have a seamstress measure you properly this afternoon," Mrs. Chen said. "Mr. Granger wants you to have appropriate clothing." What Mr. Granger wanted seemed to be the governing principle of Blackthorn Ridge. Elena swallowed her irritation and followed Mrs. Chen downstairs to find Silas waiting in what appeared to be an office. More books than Elena had seen in her entire life, a desk that looked like it weighed more than a horse, and windows overlooking the valley. He looked different in daylight and in his own space, still rough around the edges, but the bearing was different. This was a man used to authority, to being obeyed without question. "You slept well?" he asked, not looking up from papers he was reviewing. "Well enough." Elena stayed in the doorway. "Mrs. Chen said you wanted to show me the property. I want you to understand what Blackthorn Ridge is." He set the papers aside and finally looked at her. You're going to have questions. Better to answer them now than let you make assumptions. That was probably the most self-aware thing he'd said since they met. They started with the immediate grounds around the main house, gardens currently under snow, but the structure suggested elaborate planning. A greenhouse that somehow stayed warm even in February. Storage buildings that held more supplies than Elena's entire town had access to. "How many people live here?" she asked as they walked. 47 year-round, more during harvest season. Silas moved with easy familiarity through paths he'd clearly walked 1,000 times. "Everyone has a role. We're self-sufficient by necessity." Necessity? "We're 3 days' ride from the nearest town that isn't Silver Peak. Can't depend on outside supply lines." He gestured toward a long building that turned out to be a communal dining hall. "Everything we need, we make or grow ourselves." They continued through the valley, and Elena began to see the organization beneath what had looked like chaos from above. The timber operation wasn't active in winter, but Silas explained how it worked in other seasons. Selective cutting, replanting, sustainable practices that seemed almost radical compared to the strip mining approach most lumber companies used. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why go through the trouble? You could cut everything, make more money faster." Short-term thinking. Silas stopped at the edge of a grove, looking up at trees that had probably been growing since before either of them was born. "My grandfather started this operation 60 years ago. He built it to last generations, not to make quick money and disappear." "Your grandfather?" Elena turned that over. "So this has been in your family for 3 generations. Will be 4 eventually." He started walking again. "That's why I needed a wife. Inheritance laws are complicated when there's this much land and money involved." There it was, the truth she'd been waiting for. "So I'm here to produce an heir." Elena kept her voice flat. "That's the actual transaction. Eventually, maybe. Not immediately." Silas glanced at her. "I told you I wouldn't force anything. I meant it. But yes, eventually, the expectation would be children, legal heirs to continue the family line." At least he was honest about it now. Elena wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. They reached a cluster of smaller cabins set apart from the main working buildings. "Families," Silas explained. "Workers with children who needed their own space." Elena saw a woman hanging laundry despite the cold, saw children playing in the snow with the kind of energy that spoke of regular meals and warm beds. "Everyone here gets paid," Silas continued. "Fair wages, housing, food. Their children get education. We have a teacher who runs lessons in the winter. You run a company town." Elena had heard of those. Usually they were nightmares of control and exploitation. "I run a community." His voice held an edge. "There's a difference." Maybe there was. Elena had seen enough company towns, mining operations where workers lived in shacks and bought overpriced supplies from company stores, to recognize that Blackthorn Ridge was something else. Better, probably, though she wasn't ready to say that out loud. They circled back toward the main house through a different route, passing workshops where men and women worked on winter tasks, equipment repair, leatherworking, carpentry. People nodded to Silas as they passed, respectful but not fearful. He knew most of them by name. "You said you disguised yourself to escape greedy social elites," Elena said as they climbed the steps to the house. "What does that mean exactly?" Silas paused with his hand on the door. "It means my family has money, and people in Denver know it. Women who want access to wealth, men who want business partnerships. Everyone wants something, and none of them want me. They want what I represent." "So you pretend to be a drifter?" "I am a drifter when I'm away from here. Everything I told you is true. I just didn't mention the parts I left behind." He opened the door. "You can be angry about that if you want. Won't change anything." Elena followed him inside, frustration simmering. "You let me think you were poor. You assumed I was poor. I didn't correct you because it wasn't relevant to the arrangement." "It's extremely relevant. I thought I was marrying someone who at least understood what it was like to struggle. I do understand." Silas stopped in the entrance hall, turning to face her fully. "My grandfather came west with nothing. Built this from scratch, while people died around him from weather, disease, and accidents. My father expanded it while fighting off claim jumpers and dealing with tribal conflicts that could have destroyed everything. I've spent my entire life maintaining what they built, while Denver businessmen try to steal it through contracts and legal manipulation. Don't assume I don't understand struggle just because I have money now. The intensity in his voice caught Elena off guard. This was the most emotion she'd seen from him, and it was anger, controlled, but definitely anger. Fine, she said, but you still lied. I omitted. There's a difference. Not to me. They stared at each other in the entrance hall, and Elena realized this was their first real fight as a married couple. Over honesty and assumptions and the vast gap between what each of them had thought they were getting into. I need to work, Silas said finally. Mrs. Chen will help you settle in. We'll have dinner together tonight, and you can ask whatever questions you have. Fair? Do I have a choice? You always have choices, Elena. You just might not like them. He walked away toward his office, and she was alone again in the too large house. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity Elena hadn't expected. Mrs. Chen introduced her to the household staff. A cook named James who had opinions about everything, 2 younger women who handled cleaning and laundry, a man named Thomas who managed the grounds and gave Elena a look that suggested he knew exactly how little she belonged here. A seamstress came and measured her for new clothes while chattering about fabric and styles Elena didn't understand. Marie from the kitchen brought lunch and tried to make conversation that Elena mostly deflected because she didn't know how to explain her situation in ways that made sense. By late afternoon, Elena's head was pounding from trying to remember names and roles and the complex social structure of Blackthorn Ridge. She escaped to her room and stood at the window, looking out at the valley as snow began to fall again. This was her life now. This place, these people, this man who was her husband-in-law, but a stranger in every way that mattered. She thought about her family in the cabin that was probably warm for the first time in months. Thought about Rosie taking care of their father with medicine that might actually help. Thought about Samuel eating his fill instead of going to bed hungry. The price had been herself, but they were safe. That had to be worth something. Dinner was served in a formal dining room that could have seated 20 people but currently held just 2. Silas sat at one end of a table that stretched absurdly between them, and Elena sat at the other, and they ate excellent food in uncomfortable silence for 10 minutes before she couldn't take it anymore. This is ridiculous, she said. We're shouting distance apart. Silas looked up from his plate. You want to sit closer? I want to have a conversation without feeling like I'm in a cathedral. Something that might have been amusement crossed his face. He stood, bringing his plate and wine glass, and moved to the chair adjacent to hers. Better? Marginally. They ate in silence for another minute before Silas spoke. You have questions. Ask them. Elena set down her fork. Why me? Specifically, you could have found someone in Denver, made it a social arrangement with someone who actually wanted this life. I told you. No. You told me about not wanting women who want your money. But there are probably decent women in the world who would marry for security without being desperate. Why go to Silver Peak? Why my family? Silas took a drink before answering. I needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about where I came from. Someone practical enough to understand the arrangement without romantic delusions, and someone who had enough at stake that they'd honor the contract. So you researched us. Found out we were desperate enough. Yes. He didn't apologize for it. Your father's debts are public record. Your situation wasn't hard to assess. The clinical nature of it made Elena's skin crawl. You picked me like you'd pick a horse, checked my background, made sure I was desperate enough, then made your offer. That's accurate, yes. At least he wasn't lying anymore. Elena picked up her wine glass. She'd never had wine before coming here, and drank more than she probably should have. What happens now? You settle in, learn how things work here. Eventually, you'll find a role that suits you. Silas cut into his meat with precise movements. This doesn't have to be a prison, Elena. You can make a life here if you're willing to try. And if I'm not willing, then you'll be miserable. But you'll still be fed and housed and safe. He met her eyes. I meant what I said about not keeping you prisoner. You want to leave, you can leave. But your family's security depends on this marriage remaining intact, so I'd suggest you think carefully before running. There it was. Not a threat exactly, but a reminder of the stakes. Her choices affected more than just herself. How long do I have before you expect? Elena couldn't finish the sentence. Before I expect us to act like a married couple in more than name, Silas's voice was matter-of-fact. As long as you need. I'm not interested in forcing that situation. When and if it happens, it'll be because we both agree to it. That's surprisingly decent of you. I'm not a monster, Elena. I'm just practical. He returned to his meal. You'll learn the difference if you stay long enough. They finished dinner in silence that was slightly less uncomfortable than before. Silas excused himself to work on paperwork, and Elena retreated to her room, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. She lay in the too-soft bed and tried to imagine a future here. Tried to see herself fitting into Blackthorn Ridge's rhythms, finding purpose in whatever role Silas thought she should fill. Tried to picture a version of this arrangement that didn't feel like she'd sold herself into comfortable captivity. Sleep came eventually, and with it dreams of her father's cabin that morphed into the main house, spaces bleeding together until she couldn't remember which was home and which was prison. The next week passed in a strange routine. Mornings, she'd wake to find Silas already gone. He worked constantly, disappearing into his office or out to the work sites before dawn. Mrs. Chen would bring breakfast and offer vague suggestions about how Elena might spend her day. She explored the property more thoroughly, learning the geography of Blackthorn Ridge. Met more of the workers who ranged from friendly to suspicious to utterly indifferent to her presence. Learned that the seamstress's name was Ruth, and she'd been here 15 years. That James the cook had worked on riverboats before coming to the mountains. That Marie was saving money to eventually leave and start her own business, though she wouldn't say doing what. Everyone had stories, and slowly Elena began to piece together the larger narrative of Blackthorn Ridge. It had been founded by Silas's grandfather Jeremiah during the initial Colorado gold rush, but Jeremiah had been smart enough to recognize timber would outlast gold. He'd claimed the entire valley through a combination of legal purchases and creative interpretation of homestead laws, then built an operation designed for sustainability rather than quick profit. Silas's father had defended the property through various legal challenges and one particularly nasty conflict with a Denver syndicate that wanted to force a sale. He'd died 10 years ago. Illness, people said, though nobody gave specifics. And Silas had inherited everything at 23. Too young, Mrs. Chen said one morning while reviewing household accounts with Elena. Apparently part of her role would be managing domestic operations. But he grew into it. Harder than his father, but fair. Elena was beginning to see that fairness. Workers who got injured were cared for without losing pay. Families who needed extra support received it without questions. When a fire damaged one of the cabins, Silas had crews rebuilding it within days, but there was also distance. Silas ran Blackthorn Ridge with absolute authority, and while he listened to input, final decisions were always his. People respected him, but Elena wasn't sure anyone actually knew him, including his wife. They had dinner together most nights, conversations that covered practical topics, property management, supply needs, plans for spring operations, but nothing personal. Elena learned that Silas preferred coffee, black and strong, that he read extensively but never discussed what he read, that he had a scar on his left hand from a childhood accident he wouldn't elaborate on. In return, she told him about her family in careful doses, Rosie's stubbornness, Samuel's quiet intelligence, her father's slow decline, and her mother's absence. Silas listened without much reaction, processing information the way he processed everything, clinically, thoroughly, without apparent emotion. 2 weeks into her new life, Elena was in the greenhouse helping Ruth plant early seeds when Marie came running up, breathless. Mrs. Granger, sorry, Elena, Mr. Granger needs you at the main house. Right now. The urgency in her voice made Elena's stomach drop. What's wrong? Visitors from Denver. Marie's eyes were wide. Important ones, he said. You need to change into something formal. Elena looked down at her work dress, already dirty from potting soil. I don't have anything formal. Mrs. Chen does. Come on. They ran back to the house, where Mrs. Chen was already pulling a dress from somewhere, dark blue with proper buttons and a collar that looked expensive. Elena changed quickly while Mrs. Chen did something to her hair that involved pins and arrangements Elena couldn't track. Who's visiting? She asked. Mr. Granger's aunt. Mrs. Chen's mouth was a thin line. Margaret Granger. She's difficult. That seemed like understatement based on Mrs. Chen's expression. Elena was presentable, or as presentable as she was going to get, in 10 minutes. Mrs. Chen led her downstairs to the formal sitting room where Silas stood near the fireplace with a woman who could only be Margaret Granger. She was tall, thin, and dressed in the kind of clothes Elena had only seen in magazine illustrations. Her hair was silver and styled elaborately. Her posture suggested she'd never slouched in her entire life. And her eyes, when they landed on Elena, were sharp enough to cut. "So this is her." Margaret's voice carried the particular condescension of someone used to being obeyed. "The mountain girl you married." "Elena," Silas said, and something in his tone was warning. "This is my aunt, Margaret Granger. She's come from Denver with some business associates." "How lovely." Margaret smiled without warmth. "I'm sure we'll have so much to discuss." Elena looked at Silas, who met her eyes with an expression that clearly said, "Be careful," and realized that whatever peace she'd found at Blackthorn Ridge was about to shatter. Margaret Granger moved through the sitting room like she owned it, which technically she didn't, but her bearing suggested she'd never let facts interfere with her sense of authority. She settled into the best chair near the fireplace without being invited, and arranged her skirts with the kind of precision that came from decades of practice. "Tea, I think," she said, not quite looking at Elena, "unless mountain hospitality doesn't extend to basic courtesies." Silas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Chen is already preparing it." "How efficient." Margaret's gaze finally landed fully on Elena, assessing in a way that made her feel like livestock being evaluated. "So tell me, my dear, how exactly did you trap my nephew into this unfortunate arrangement?" "I didn't trap anyone." Elena kept her voice level, despite the anger sparking in her chest. "He made an offer. I accepted. How romantic." The sarcasm could have stripped paint. "And what qualified you for the position of Mrs. Granger? Your extensive education, your refined upbringing, your knowledge of how to manage a significant estate?" "Margaret," Silas started, "I'm simply trying to understand, nephew. You disappear for a week and return married to a complete stranger from a mining camp. Surely you can forgive my curiosity about what prompted such rash behavior." Mrs. Chen arrived with tea service, setting it down with movements that were slightly more forceful than necessary. Elena caught the older woman's eye and saw sympathy there, which somehow made the whole situation worse. "I'll pour," Margaret said, taking control of the teapot like it was a weapon. "How do you take yours, Elena? Or perhaps you're more accustomed to coffee from a tin cup. However you're serving, it is fine." Elena accepted the delicate china cup and saucer, trying not to think about how one wrong move would shatter something that probably cost more than a month's wages. Silas stood near the window, his posture rigid in a way Elena was beginning to recognize as barely controlled frustration. "You said you came on business, Margaret. Perhaps we should discuss that rather than interrogating my wife." "Oh, but she is the business, darling. You've created quite the complication." Margaret sipped her tea with exaggerated delicacy. "The investors I've been courting for the expansion are extremely concerned about stability. A sudden marriage to an unknown woman from poverty doesn't exactly inspire confidence." "What investors?" Elena asked, and both Margaret and Silas turned to look at her. "Sorry, but I live here now. Seems like I should know what's being discussed." Something flickered in Silas's expression, surprise, maybe, or approval. Hard to tell. "The Denver Timber Consortium," Margaret said, her tone suggesting Elena should have already known this. "We've been negotiating a partnership that would expand Blackthorn Ridge operations significantly. Triple output within 2 years, access to railhead connections, real profit instead of this sustainable fantasy your husband insists on maintaining." "It's not sustainable if we destroy the forest," Silas said flatly. "It's not profitable if we don't." Margaret set down her cup with a click. "Jeremiah built this place, yes, but he built it in a different era. The world has changed. Demand for timber is exploding. We're sitting on a fortune, and you're treating it like a hobby farm." Elena watched the exchange, seeing the real conflict beneath the polite words. This wasn't just about business. This was family history, old arguments wearing new clothes. "My father rejected your expansion plans," Silas said. "I'm doing the same." "Your father died before he could see reason." Margaret's voice went cold. "And now you've complicated everything further by marrying some desperate girl who doesn't understand what she's walked into." The casual cruelty of it hit Elena harder than she expected. Not because it was wrong, she was desperate, didn't fully understand Blackthorn Ridge. But because Margaret said it like Elena wasn't even in the room, like she was furniture to be discussed, not a person who could hear every word. "Watch your tone," Silas said quietly, and there was threat beneath the calm. "Or what? You'll ask me to leave your property? I own 30% of this operation, nephew, my brother's share, left to me when he died. You can't simply dismiss me because I speak uncomfortable truths." Elena's tea had gone cold in her hands. She set it down carefully on the side table. 30% isn't controlling interest. Margaret's gaze snapped to her. "Excuse me? You own 30%. Silas owns the other 70, which means you can voice opinions, but ultimately, decisions are his." Elena met those sharp eyes without flinching. "That's how percentages work." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Silas had gone very still near the window. Mrs. Chen, who was still lurking near the door, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Margaret's smile was all teeth. "How clever. Can you also read, or is basic arithmetic the extent of your education?" "I can read, write too. Even do sums beyond simple percentages." Elena kept her voice pleasant. "My mother made sure of it before she died. Said education was the one thing nobody could take from you." "How quaint. Though I noticed she didn't teach you about appropriate behavior in polite company." "Probably because we weren't polite company. We were poor company, desperate company, as you so accurately pointed out." Elena stood, smoothing her borrowed dress. "But since I'm here now, married to your nephew, whether you approve or not, perhaps we should establish some ground rules. You can dislike me all you want. You can think I'm beneath Blackthorn Ridge and unworthy of the Granger name. But you'll keep the personal attacks to yourself, or I'll make every single interaction we have so unpleasant you'll regret making the trip from Denver." Margaret's face had gone rigid with shock. Silas was staring at Elena like he'd never seen her before. Mrs. Chen had abandoned any pretense of not listening and was watching with open interest. "Well," Margaret said finally, "at least she has a spine, that's something. It's everything." Silas moved away from the window, and Elena saw something new in his expression. Respect, maybe, or at least interest. "Elena's right about the percentages, Margaret. You have influence, not control. If you came here thinking you could pressure me into selling or expanding beyond sustainable limits, you wasted your trip. I came because the investors want to meet you both. They're in Denver, waiting." Margaret stood, all pretense of polite visiting abandoned. "The governor will be at the reception, half the territorial legislature, business leaders who could make or break Blackthorn Ridge's future. They want to see this supposed partnership you've created, the timber baron and his mountain bride, and assess whether you're stable enough to invest in." "I'm not interested in their investment," Silas said. "Then you're a fool." Margaret's voice cut like glass. "The railroad is coming through the Rockies within 5 years. When it does, timber operations that can't scale to meet demand will be crushed by those that can. This isn't about greed, nephew. It's about survival. Survival that requires destroying the forest isn't survival. It's suicide with better profit margins." Margaret turned her attention back to Elena, and the calculation in her eyes was obvious. "The reception is in 2 weeks. Governor's mansion, formal dress, everyone who matters in Denver. You'll both attend and show these investors that this marriage is legitimate and stable." She paused. "Unless, of course, your wife isn't capable of handling such sophisticated company, in which case, perhaps we should reconsider the entire arrangement." The trap was obvious. Refuse, and Margaret would use it as evidence of Elena's inadequacy. Attend, and Elena would be thrown into a world she had no preparation for, where failure would be equally damning. "We'll be there," Elena said before Silas could speak. Margaret's smile was predatory. "Wonderful. I'll send details. Do try to find her something appropriate to wear, Silas. First impressions matter, and I'd hate for investors to think Blackthorn Ridge can't afford proper clothing for its mistress." She swept out of the room in a rustle of expensive fabric, leaving silence in her wake. Silas waited until the front door closed before turning to Elena. "You didn't have to agree to that." "Yes, I did." Elena's hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline catching up to her. "She was testing us, testing me. If I'd backed down, she'd have used it against you. She'll use the reception against us regardless. You'll be walking into a room full of people like her, wealthy, educated, ready to tear apart anyone they see as weak. Then I'll need to not be weak. Elena sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. How bad is it? The social situation, I mean. What exactly am I walking into? Silas poured himself whiskey from a decanter on the sideboard, then poured a second glass and brought it to Elena. She took it despite having barely finished her tea. Denver society is complicated, he said, settling into the chair Margaret had vacated. Old money from the mining boom, new money from railroads and industry, political figures trying to position Colorado for statehood. Everyone's connected to everyone else through business or marriage or mutual blackmail. Margaret moves through it easily because she was born to it. My father hated it, so I grew up mostly here, which means I'm an outsider despite the family name. And now you've married someone even more outside. Elena sipped the whiskey and immediately regretted it. Too strong, burning all the way down. I'm going to humiliate you, or you'll surprise them the way you just surprised Margaret. Silas's expression was unreadable. She wasn't expecting you to fight back. I wasn't expecting to either. Elena set down the whiskey. But I'm tired of people treating me like I'm nothing. Your aunt walked in here ready to dismiss me completely, and I just couldn't let that stand. Good. Silas drank his whiskey in one swallow. That instinct will serve you well in Denver. They can smell weakness like predators, and they'll exploit it without hesitation. So what do? I don't know how to be sophisticated. Don't know which fork to use or how to make polite conversation about things I've never experienced. You do what you just did. Be honest, be direct, and don't apologize for what you don't know. Silas stood, moving to stare out the window at the snow-covered valley. Margaret wants you to fail, because if you do, she can use it to pressure me into accepting her investors. She doesn't care about Blackthorn Ridge's future. She cares about profit and her own influence. If you can hold your ground at that reception, you'll undermine everything she's trying to accomplish. No pressure, then. Elena tried to smile and failed. Over the next 2 weeks, the atmosphere at Blackthorn Ridge shifted in ways Elena didn't fully understand. Silas spent more time with her, not in their awkward formal dinners, but in practical preparation. He explained Denver's social structure, naming families and their relationships to each other and to the Granger fortune. Described the governor, a political opportunist who'd support whoever seemed most likely to bring prosperity to the territory. Outlined the investors Margaret had courted, men from Chicago and St. Louis who saw Colorado timber as their next fortune. Mrs. Chen brought in a tutor of sorts, a woman named Caroline who'd worked as a governess in Boston before coming west with a husband who'd died in a mining accident. She taught Elena things like proper table manners, polite conversation topics, how to dance despite never having had music lessons. You're not trying to become them, Caroline said during one particularly frustrating lesson. You're trying to move through their world without giving them ammunition. There's a difference. Ruth the seamstress worked overtime creating dresses that would be appropriate for a governor's reception. Elena stood through endless fittings, watching fabric transform into clothing she'd never imagined wearing. The main dress was deep burgundy with black trim, elegant without being flashy, expensive without screaming wealth. You look like a lady, Ruth said during the final fitting. A real lady, not someone playing dress-up. Elena stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the reflection. The dress fit perfectly, tailored to her body in ways that made her look taller, more substantial. Her hair was arranged elaborately. Marie had been practicing different styles every evening. She looked like she belonged in photographs of rich people's parties, not in a cabin where hunger was a constant companion. The disconnect was dizzying. Marie helped her practice walking in the formal shoes, which had heels higher than anything Elena had attempted. Just take small steps, and if you need to, hold on to something. Better to look cautious than to fall on your face in front of the governor. Encouraging, Elena muttered, but she practiced anyway. The night before they were supposed to leave for Denver, Silas found Elena in the greenhouse. She'd taken to spending time there when the preparation became overwhelming. Something about the plants and soil reminded her that real things still existed beneath all the performance they were constructing. Second thoughts? He asked, settling onto a workbench beside where she was repotting seedlings that didn't really need repotting. 1,000 thoughts, probably. Elena didn't look up from the dirt. I keep thinking about what happens when I fail. When I say the wrong thing, or use the wrong fork, or commit some social error I don't even know exists. Your aunt wins, the investors dismiss you, and Blackthorn Ridge gets absorbed into whatever Margaret's planning. If that happens, it happens. We'll deal with it. Elena finally looked at him. You're surprisingly calm about potentially losing everything your grandfather built. I'm not calm. I'm realistic. Silas picked up one of the clay pots, turning it in his hands. Margaret's been circling Blackthorn Ridge since my father died. She thinks I'm too idealistic, too attached to sustainable practices that limit profit. She's probably right that I could make more money her way. But money isn't the only measure of success. Tell that to someone who's been poor. The words came out harder than Elena intended. Money matters. It's the difference between survival and death. I know. That's why I made sure your family has enough. Silas set down the pot. But there's a difference between having enough and destroying everything in pursuit of more. Margaret doesn't see that difference. To her, profit is the only goal, and anything that limits profit is weakness. What do you see when you look at Blackthorn Ridge? Elena asked. Home, legacy, responsibility. He paused. A promise to continue what my grandfather started, even when it would be easier to cash out and walk away. Elena thought about her own father, who'd chased gold until it destroyed him, who'd made promises to his family he couldn't keep because he'd been focused on the fortune just out of reach, instead of the people right in front of him. There was something almost noble in Silas's commitment to sustainability, even if she didn't fully understand it yet. I'll do my best at the reception, she said finally. Not for Margaret or the investors, but because you gave my family a chance when nobody else would. That counts for something. It counts for everything. Silas stood, brushing dirt from his pants. And Elena, you're stronger than you think. Margaret saw that immediately. That's why she's worried. He left before Elena could respond, and she sat alone in the greenhouse, surrounded by growing things, trying to believe his words. The trip to Denver took 2 days by coach. Silas had arranged for them to stay at a hotel, the Brown Palace, which Elena had heard of but never imagined entering. When they arrived, she tried not to gawk at the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, tried to act like she belonged in spaces this grand. Their suite had separate bedrooms connected by a sitting room, maintaining the careful distance they'd established at Blackthorn Ridge. Silas disappeared almost immediately to meet with business associates, leaving Elena alone with trunks full of new clothes and mounting panic about the reception scheduled for tomorrow evening. Margaret arrived that afternoon without warning, sweeping into the suite like she'd been invited. I've come to offer assistance, she announced, settling into the best chair. Tomorrow you'll be representing the Granger family, and I'd hate for you to embarrass us through ignorance. How kind. Elena kept her voice neutral, though her hands wanted to ball into fists. The governor's wife is particularly fond of discussing charity work. I'd suggest you avoid mentioning your own charitable origins. Some might find it distasteful. Margaret smiled. The investors will want to hear about Blackthorn Ridge's operations, but avoid technical details. Women discussing business makes men uncomfortable. Then perhaps they should become more comfortable. The words slipped out before Elena could stop them. Margaret's expression hardened. This is exactly the kind of inappropriate behavior that will destroy you tomorrow. You're not in a mining camp anymore. Society has rules, and breaking them has consequences. I'm aware of that. Are you? Because from where I'm sitting, you seem determined to prove your unsuitability. Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts. Let me be clear, my dear. I don't want you to fail tomorrow. I need you to fail. When you do, and you will, the investors will see that Silas is too unstable to manage a major expansion. They'll withdraw their interest, and I'll have leverage to force a more reasonable arrangement, one where Blackthorn Ridge operates at full capacity under proper management. The honesty was almost refreshing. At least Margaret had stopped pretending. You've miscalculated, Elena said quietly. Have I? You think I'll fail because I'm poor and uneducated, because I don't know society's rules or how to navigate wealthy company. Elena met Margaret's eyes. But you're forgetting something. I've spent my entire life navigating situations where one wrong move meant my family didn't eat, where every decision had life or death stakes. Your social games are vicious, but they're not deadly. I've survived worse than you can imagine. Margaret studied her for a long moment. Perhaps, but survival in poverty and success in society are completely different skills. Tomorrow will prove which matters more. After she left, Elena sat in the ornate suite and tried to calm her racing heart. Margaret was right that she was outmatched, right that Elena had no real preparation for what was coming, but she was also wrong about one crucial thing. Elena wasn't trying to win Margaret's game. She was trying to survive it, and survival was something Elena knew intimately. Silas returned late, looking tired in a way Elena hadn't seen before. "Margaret came by," she said. "She made sure I knew exactly how much she wants me to fail tomorrow." Of course she did. Silas poured himself a drink from the sweets bar. That's Margaret's strategy. Undermine your confidence, make you so anxious you fulfill her predictions. She did the same thing to my father. Did it work? He stopped attending social functions entirely, ran Blackthorn Ridge from the mountains, and let Margaret handle Denver business, which gave her exactly the influence she wanted. Silas sat heavily on the sofa. "I won't make the same mistake." Elena joined him, maintaining careful distance on the opposite end. "What if I do fail? What if I'm so out of my depth tomorrow that I make everything worse?" Then we adapt. Margaret doesn't have as much power as she thinks she does. The investors are interested in profit, not social performance. If Blackthorn Ridge continues to operate successfully, they'll invest regardless of whether Denver society approves of my choice in wife. You sound certain. I'm not. But I've learned that showing uncertainty is the same as admitting weakness, and weakness is exploited immediately. Silas looked at her directly. "Tomorrow, you'll walk into that reception as my wife, Mrs. Granger, heir to the Blackthorn Ridge fortune. Let them think whatever they want about your background. Your job isn't to win their approval, it's to show them you can't be dismissed." Elena thought about Margaret's warnings, about all the ways she could fail. What if I say something wrong? Use the wrong fork, or commit some social error? Then you'll have committed a social error. It's not death, Elena, it's just uncomfortable. Silas finished his drink. Besides, half those people at the reception have their own scandals they're desperate to hide. You're not the only one performing. The reception was held at the governor's mansion, a building that made even the Brown Palace look modest. Elena arrived on Silas's arm, wearing Ruth's burgundy creation and trying to remember Caroline's lessons about posture and expression. Around her, Denver's elite clustered in groups that shifted and reformed like patterns in a kaleidoscope. Margaret was already there, holding court, with a group of expensively dressed women who stopped their conversation to stare as Elena entered. The assessment was immediate and obvious, gazes cataloging everything from her dress to her jewelry to the way she carried herself. "Mrs. Granger," one of them said, and the title sounded like a question rather than acknowledgement. "How lovely to finally meet you. Margaret has told us so much." "I'm sure she has." Elena smiled without warmth. "Though I'd take anything Margaret says about me with appropriate skepticism. We have different perspectives on most things." The woman's eyebrows rose. Beside Elena, Silas made a sound that might have been suppressed amusement. Margaret herself appeared moments later, all false warmth and social grace. "Let me introduce you to some people, my dear. I'm sure you're overwhelmed by all this sophistication." She steered Elena away from Silas with practiced efficiency, moving through the crowd toward a group of men who were clearly the investors she'd mentioned. They were older, wealthy in a way that showed in everything from their tailored suits to their easy confidence. These were men used to power, to being obeyed without question. "Gentlemen, allow me to present my nephew's new wife, Elena Granger. Elena, this is Mr. Harrison from Chicago, Mr. Webb from St. Louis, and Mr. Coughlin, who represents several interests in New York." Harrison looked her up and down with the same assessment he might give a horse. "Charming. Where exactly did Silas find you, Mrs. Granger?" "A mining town called Silver Peak." Elena kept her voice steady. "I grew up there." "Silver Peak." Webb's tone made it sound dirty. "I've heard of it. Rough place from what I understand. Must be quite a change coming to Denver." "It's different, yes, though I'm not sure better is accurate." Elena met his gaze without flinching. "Silver Peak is honest about what it is. Everyone knows who's struggling and who's not. Denver seems to prefer pretending poverty doesn't exist as long as it stays in the right neighborhoods." The silence that followed was sharp. Margaret's expression had gone rigid. Harrison and Webb exchanged glances that clearly said this is exactly what we expected. Then Coughlin laughed, actually laughed, a genuine sound that broke the tension. "She's got teeth, Margaret. You didn't mention that." "I'm still learning about Elena's various qualities," Margaret said tightly. "I like her." Coughlin turned his attention back to Elena. tell me, Mrs. Granger, what do you think about this expansion proposal Margaret's been pushing? Your husband opposes it, but that's based on environmental concerns. What's your perspective? The trap was obvious. Anything Elena said would either undermine Silas or prove her ignorance. Margaret was watching with barely concealed satisfaction, waiting for the inevitable stumble. Elena took a breath and chose honesty. I think there's probably money to be made in aggressive harvesting. But I also think my husband understands something that's easy to forget when you're chasing profit. Forests don't grow back overnight. Strip Blackthorn Ridge now, and maybe you make a fortune. But 30 years from now, when the railroad brings even more demand and every other operation has cut themselves into barren valleys, Blackthorn Ridge will still have timber to sell. That's not idealism. That's long-term business strategy. Coughlin's expression shifted to something approaching respect. Interesting perspective. You've put thought into this. I've put thought into survival. It's amazing how clear you think when scarcity is your constant companion. Elena glanced at Margaret. In Silver Peak, we learned early that consuming everything immediately meant starvation later. Same principle applies to timber, just different scale. Webb was nodding slowly. Harrison looked intrigued despite himself, and Margaret's face had gone pale with suppressed fury. Of course, survival is different from profit, Margaret interjected quickly. These gentlemen represent serious investment capital, not charitable concerns about future generations. Profit and survival aren't mutually exclusive, Elena said, unless you're so focused on immediate returns that you ignore long-term stability. Which is exactly what your husband is doing by refusing modernization, Margaret snapped, her composure cracking. Blackthorn Ridge could triple output, but Silas insists on his grandfather's outdated methods. Methods that have sustained operations for 60 years while other timber companies have already exhausted their resources and moved on. Elena's voice had gone cold. You talk about modernization like it's progress, but from what I've seen, your version of modern business means extracting maximum value as quickly as possible and leaving destruction behind. That's not business. That's robbery dressed in better clothes. The reception had gone quiet around them. Elena realized too late that her voice had risen, that people were staring, that she'd just committed exactly the kind of scene Margaret had been hoping for. Except Margaret wasn't smiling. She was furious, her careful social mask crumbling to reveal the calculating anger beneath. How dare you, Margaret hissed. You know nothing about business or what this family has built. I know enough to recognize greed disguised as progress. Elena's hands were shaking, but she kept going because stopping now would be worse than never starting. You want to destroy what Silas's grandfather created so you can profit in the short term. You dress it up with talk about investors and modernization, but ultimately you're asking him to betray everything Blackthorn Ridge stands for. And when he refuses, you blame me for influencing him, as if he couldn't possibly have principles of his own. This is exactly what I warned about, Margaret said, louder now, addressing the investors. Silas has allowed himself to be influenced by someone with no education, no understanding of real business. Actually, a new voice interrupted, I'd say she understands business better than you give her credit for. The governor himself had appeared at the edge of their circle, his expression interested rather than scandalized. Thomas Baxter was known for being politically shrewd, and right now he was watching Elena like she'd surprised him. Mrs. Granger makes a compelling point, he continued. Colorado's future depends on sustainable resource management, not the boom and bust cycle that's destroyed other territories. Perhaps we should hear more about Blackthorn Ridge's long-term strategy rather than focusing solely on immediate profit margins. Margaret's expression was murderous, but she couldn't contradict the governor without making the situation worse. Silas appeared at Elena's elbow, his presence solid and steadying. Governor Baxter, I didn't realize you'd taken an interest in timber operations. I take an interest in anything that affects Colorado's statehood prospects. Baxter smiled. And sustainability is becoming a significant concern in Washington. Operations that demonstrate responsible resource management have political value beyond simple profit. The conversation shifted then, becoming more technical as Silas explained Blackthorn Ridge's practices in detail. The investors listened with different levels of interest, and Elena realized they weren't the monolith Margaret had presented. Harrison still looked skeptical, but Webb and Coughlin were asking genuine questions about long-term yields and market positioning. Margaret had been outmaneuvered, and she knew it. She excused herself from the conversation with stiff politeness, retreating to another part of the reception where Elena could see her gathering her allies. "You made an enemy tonight," Silas said quietly, once they had a moment alone. "Margaret won't forget this." "She was already my enemy." Elena accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, her hand still trembling slightly. "I just stopped pretending otherwise." The rest of the reception passed in a blur of introductions and careful conversations. Elena met the governor's wife, who turned out to be less interested in charity work than in honest discussion about poverty. Apparently, her own background wasn't as privileged as her current position suggested. She spoke with other women who ranged from dismissive to genuinely curious, and she navigated it all with mounting exhaustion and the growing sense that she'd survived something important. As they finally left the mansion near midnight, climbing into the carriage that would take them back to the hotel, Elena felt the full weight of the evening crash down on her. "I made a scene," she said quietly. "Exactly what Margaret wanted. You made a stand." Silas sat across from her in the carriage, his expression impossible to read in the darkness. "There's a difference. Margaret expected you to be passive, to let her control the narrative. Instead, you challenged her directly, and you did it in front of people whose opinions she cares about. That's not failure, Elena. That's strategy." "It didn't feel strategic. It felt like losing my temper." "Sometimes they're the same thing." He paused. The governor was impressed. So were at least two of the investors. Margaret's plan to use you as evidence of my poor judgment backfired spectacularly. Elena leaned her head back against the carriage seat, suddenly too tired to care about posture or propriety. "What happens now?" "Now we go home to Blackthorn Ridge. Margaret will regroup and try again. She's nothing if not persistent. But tonight, you proved something important." "What?" "That you belong here. Not because you learned which fork to use or how to make polite conversation, but because you refused to be what Margaret expected. That matters more than any social performance." The carriage rolled through Denver's streets, passing from wealth to poverty, and back again in the space of blocks. Elena watched the changing landscape and thought about survival, about the different forms it could take. She'd survived hunger and cold and her father's slow death. Tonight, she'd survived Denver society and Margaret's manipulations. But she also knew, with bone-deep certainty, that the real battle was just beginning. Margaret struck 3 days after they returned to Blackthorn Ridge, and she struck hard. The legal papers arrived by courier, thick documents with official seals that Silas spread across his office desk while Elena watched from the doorway. His expression went from neutral to thunderous as he read. "What is it?" Elena asked. "A challenge to the marriage's validity." Silas's voice was controlled, but she could hear the anger beneath. "Margaret's claiming fraud. Says I misrepresented the terms to you, that you married under false pretenses without understanding the financial implications, and that the contract should be voided." Elena's stomach dropped. "Can she do that?" "She can try. She's also filed an injunction preventing any major business decisions until the matter is resolved, which effectively freezes Blackthorn Ridge operations." He looked up, and his eyes were cold. "This is retaliation for the reception. She can't control the narrative anymore, so she's trying to invalidate you entirely." "Will it work?" "Depends on the judge." Silas stood, moving to the window that overlooked the valley. "If she gets someone sympathetic to her position, they could rule that the marriage was coercive because of your family's financial situation. Claim I took advantage of your desperation." The irony wasn't lost on Elena. "You did take advantage of my desperation. That was the entire arrangement. Yes, but you understood the terms and agreed anyway. That's not fraud. That's a business transaction between adults." He turned back to her. "Margaret's argument is that you couldn't have truly understood what you were agreeing to because of the power imbalance. She'll paint you as a victim who needs rescuing from your own decisions." "I'm not a victim." The words came out fierce. "I know that. You know that. But Margaret's going to present it differently. And she's very good at controlling how things look." Silas gathered the papers. "The hearing is in 2 weeks. Denver courthouse, same judge who presided over several cases involving my father. Harrison Mitchell. He's fair, mostly, but he's also traditional. Doesn't like rapid change or anything that disrupts established social order." Elena thought about the reception, about standing in front of Denver's elite and refusing to be what they expected. "What do we need to do?" Prove the marriage is legitimate, that you understood the terms, agreed willingly, and that there's genuine partnership rather than exploitation." Silas's expression was grim. "Margaret will bring witnesses. People who will testify about your poverty, your lack of education, how desperate your situation was. She'll make you sound like you had no choice." "I didn't have a choice. Not really." Elena met his eyes. "But that doesn't mean I didn't choose. That's what we need the judge to understand." Over the next 2 weeks, Blackthorn Ridge operated under a cloud of uncertainty. The injunction meant they couldn't make any significant contracts or commitments, which halted spring preparations and left workers anxious about their futures. Margaret had calculated that perfectly. The longer operations stayed frozen, the more pressure Silas would face to settle on her terms. But she'd miscalculated one thing: how Blackthorn Ridge's people would respond. Mrs. Chen was the first to offer help, appearing in Elena's room one morning with tea and determination. "I've been here 23 years. I can testify about what kind of man Silas is, about how he treats people fairly and wouldn't force anyone into marriage against their will." Marie followed, then Ruth, then James the cook. Even Thomas, the groundskeeper, who'd been skeptical of Elena from the start, offered to speak about how she'd integrated into Blackthorn Ridge's operations. "You work," he said gruffly. "Not like a woman trying to impress, but like someone who understands that work matters. That counts for something." Elena was overwhelmed by the support, by people who barely knew her willing to stand up to Margaret's legal assault. But Silas was less certain about using them. "Margaret will tear them apart," he said during one of their planning sessions. "She'll make them sound like employees protecting their employer out of fear or obligation. It won't help our case, might even hurt it." "Then what will help?" Elena asked. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "The truth. All of it. Not the version that makes us look good, but what actually happened. Your desperation, my calculated offer, the transaction we both understood it was. If we try to make it sound romantic or noble, Margaret will destroy that narrative. But if we're honest about what it was, a practical arrangement between adults who needed different things from each other, then we have a chance." The hearing took place in a Denver courthouse that smelled of wood polish and old paper. Margaret arrived with her lawyers, 3 of them, expensive suits and briefcases full of documents. She also brought witnesses, a doctor who'd examined Elena's father and could testify to his condition, making her desperation clear, a shopkeeper from Silver Peak who detailed the family's debts, even a former neighbor who described the poverty Elena's family had lived in. Each testimony painted the same picture. Elena Mercer had been so desperate that she would have agreed to anything, and Silas Granger had exploited that desperation for his own purposes. Judge Mitchell listened with the careful neutrality of someone who'd heard countless cases and been disappointed by most of them. He was older, gray-haired, with eyes that suggested he'd seen every variation of human behavior and wasn't impressed by any of it. When Margaret's lawyers finished presenting their case, the judge turned to Silas. "Do you dispute any of the facts presented? That Miss Mercer, Mrs. Granger, was in extreme financial distress when you proposed marriage?" "No, Your Honor. Her situation was exactly as described." Silas stood, his posture military straight. "That was why I approached her family in the first place." Margaret's lawyer smiled like he'd won. The judge's expression didn't change. "And you acknowledge that you offered financial relief in exchange for marriage, knowing she had limited alternatives?" "I acknowledge that I made an offer I believe she would accept because of her circumstances, yes." "Then how?" the judge said, leaning forward. "Do you defend this arrangement as anything other than coercion through economic pressure?" Silas glanced at Elena, and she saw something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Uncertainty, maybe, or the fear that honesty wouldn't be enough. Elena stood before anyone could stop her. "Your Honor, may I speak?" The judge looked surprised. "This is highly irregular, Mrs. Granger. So is having lawyers argue about my choices like I'm not in the room." Elena kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I understand Mrs. Granger, Margaret Granger, believes I was coerced into this marriage. But she's wrong about one crucial thing. I knew exactly what I was agreeing to." "You were starving," Margaret's lawyer interjected. "Your father was dying, your siblings were children, and Mr. Granger offered money you desperately needed. How could you possibly have made a free choice under those circumstances?" "Because desperation doesn't eliminate agency." Elena turned to face the courtroom, seeing Margaret's furious expression and the judge's interested one. Yes, I was desperate. Yes, my family was on the edge of destruction. And yes, Silas's offer was calculated to exploit that desperation, but I still chose to accept it. I weighed my options, which were terrible across the board, and decided this was the best one available. That's not coercion. That's making the best choice possible in an impossible situation. You couldn't have understood the full implications, the lawyer started. I understood that I was trading myself for my family's survival. I understood that Silas needed a wife for inheritance reasons and that he was willing to pay for one rather than pursue a conventional marriage. I understood the contract, the terms, and what I was giving up. Elena's voice had gone hard. What I didn't understand was that making a clear-eyed, practical decision would later be characterized as victimhood by people who've never had to choose between their own future and their family's survival. Ora satsamas kisete. The courtroom had gone silent. Judge Mitchell was watching her with sharp attention. Mrs. Margaret Granger wants to invalidate my marriage because she believes I'm too poor, too uneducated, and too desperate to make valid decisions about my own life. But that's not protection. That's condescension. It's saying that because I came from poverty, my choices don't count, that I need wealthy people to make decisions for me because I can't possibly understand my own circumstances. That's not what we're saying, Margaret interjected. Yes, it is. Elena turned to face her directly. You stood in that courtroom and paraded my poverty like evidence of incompetence. You brought witnesses to testify about my desperation like it proves I'm incapable of rational thought. But poverty doesn't make you stupid, Margaret. It makes you practical. It teaches you to assess situations quickly and make hard choices without the luxury of time or better options. I've been making those kinds of choices my entire life. Margaret's face had gone pale with fury. Her lawyer was shuffling papers nervously. You want to know if I understood what I was agreeing to? Elena continued. I understood that Silas was offering a transaction, my legal partnership in exchange for my family's security. I understood that he needed a wife, but didn't want the complications of a conventional marriage. And I understood that this arrangement, however unconventional, was better than any alternative available to me. That's not fraud. That's two adults making a practical agreement with open eyes. Judge Mitchell cleared his throat. Mrs. Granger, Margaret Granger, has argued that the power imbalance between you and your husband makes genuine consent impossible. How do you respond to that? Elena took a breath. There's always been a power imbalance between us, Your Honor. He has money and education and social position. I have none of those things. But I have something he needed, legal legitimacy for his inheritance claim. He could have married any woman in Denver, but they all wanted something from him he wasn't willing to give. I wanted survival, and I was honest about it. That honesty made the transaction clearer, not more exploitative. And now? The judge asked quietly. Now that you've seen what you married into, the wealth, the social complications, the battles with Mrs. Margaret Granger, do you regret your choice? It was a loaded question. Elena knew anything she said would be dissected for evidence supporting one side or the other. I regret that my family's poverty put me in a position where marriage was the best option available, she said carefully. I regret that I didn't have the luxury of marrying for love or companionship or any of the things people claim marriage should be about. But I don't regret choosing to save my family when I had the power to do so. And I don't regret partnering with someone who, for all his calculated pragmatism, has been honest about what he wanted and fair about what he promised. She sat down, her legs suddenly shaky. Silas reached over and briefly squeezed her hand under the table, the first deliberate physical contact they'd had since the wedding. Judge Mitchell called a recess, and everyone filed out of the courtroom into the hallway. Margaret cornered them immediately, her composure cracking. You're making a mistake, she hissed at Silas. This girl is going to destroy everything our family built. Our family built Blackthorn Ridge through hard work and sustainable practices, Silas interrupted. You want to destroy it through greed disguised as progress. There's a difference. The investors are primarily interested in profit, and Governor Baxter made it clear that sustainable operations have political value. I've received preliminary interest from 2 of them about partnerships that don't require destroying our forests. Silas's voice was cold. Your plan failed, Margaret. The reception didn't humiliate Elena. It showed that she understands business strategy better than you gave her credit for. This legal challenge isn't going to invalidate our marriage. It's just proving how desperate you are to maintain control you never actually had. Margaret's eyes narrowed. You think you've won? This judge could rule against you regardless of your wife's pretty speech, then he'll rule against us and we'll appeal. But either way, you've shown everyone what you're willing to do to get what you want. Harrison and Webb both reached out after the hearing was announced. They're concerned about instability, yes, but they're more concerned about partnering with someone who weaponizes family conflict for business advantage. Elena watched Margaret's face cycle through rage, calculation, and something that might have been fear. For the first time since they'd met, Margaret looked uncertain. The judge returned after an hour. Everyone filed back into the courtroom, and Elena tried to read his expression, failed completely. Judge Mitchell was a brick wall of judicial neutrality. I've reviewed the evidence presented and heard testimony from both sides, he began. This case presents an unusual situation. A marriage that began as an explicit business transaction between parties with significant power and financial imbalances. The question before this court is whether such a transaction can constitute valid consent, or whether the economic pressure involved renders that consent meaningless. Elena's heart hammered. Beside her, Silas sat perfectly still. Mrs. Margaret Granger's argument is that the economic desperation Miss Mercer, now Mrs. Granger, experienced made it impossible for her to freely consent to marriage. That argument has merit in theory. Desperation can certainly compromise decision-making capacity, and contracts signed under extreme duress are often invalid. Margaret was starting to smile. However, the judge continued, and the smile disappeared, this court also recognizes that poverty does not automatically invalidate someone's agency. To rule otherwise would be to say that poor people cannot make binding legal decisions, which would have far-reaching implications well beyond this case. He looked directly at Elena. Mrs. Elena Granger demonstrated in her testimony that she understood the terms of her marriage agreement, assessed her alternatives, and made what she believed was the best choice available under difficult circumstances. While I might personally wish she'd had better options, the fact remains that she chose this option with apparent clarity about what she was agreeing to. Elena felt dizzy with relief that she tried not to show. More significantly, Judge Mitchell continued, the evidence suggests that this marriage, however unconventionally it began, has evolved into a genuine partnership. Mrs. Granger has taken an active role in Blackthorn Ridge operations. She speaks knowledgeably about business strategy and demonstrates understanding of the complex issues facing the estate. She is not, as Mrs. Margaret Granger suggests, a helpless victim being exploited. She is an adult woman who made a difficult choice and is now living with the consequences of that choice. He shuffled his papers. Therefore, this court finds no evidence of fraud or coercion sufficient to invalidate the marriage between Silas Granger and Elena Granger. The marriage stands as legally valid, and the injunction freezing Blackthorn Ridge operations is hereby lifted. The gavel came down like a gunshot. Margaret was on her feet immediately, her lawyers scrambling to keep up. Your Honor, we intend to appeal. You're welcome to appeal, Mrs. Granger, but I doubt you'll find a higher court more sympathetic to your position. The judge's expression had gone stern. This court also notes that this case appears to be motivated more by business disputes than genuine concern for Mrs. Elena Granger's welfare. Future legal actions that waste this court's time with what amounts to family conflict disguised as contract disputes will not be viewed favorably. It was as close to a reprimand as judges gave publicly. Margaret's face went rigid with barely controlled fury. Outside the courthouse, Silas pulled Elena aside while his lawyers handled the paperwork. They stood in an alcove away from the crowd, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Thank you, he said finally, for what you said in there, about understanding the transaction, about choosing with open eyes. You didn't have to defend the arrangement that way. Yes, I did. Elena was still shaking slightly from adrenaline. Margaret was trying to make me sound like a helpless victim to undermine you. But I'm not helpless, and I made my choice knowing exactly what it meant. I wasn't going to let her rewrite that into something it wasn't. Silas studied her face like he was seeing something new. You've changed since you came to Blackthorn Ridge. Stronger, maybe. or just more willing to show the strength that was always there? I've had practice. Elena managed a smile. Between your aunt and Denver society, I've had plenty of opportunities to learn how to stand my ground. The judge was right about one thing, Silas said quietly. This has become a partnership. Not the one either of us planned initially, but a real one nonetheless. Elena thought about the past months, the early awkwardness, the gradual understanding, the way they'd learned to work together despite everything. Is that enough? For you, I mean. You wanted a wife for legal purposes, and you got one. But you also got someone who argues with your aunt and causes social scandals and generally makes your life more complicated. Complicated isn't necessarily bad. Silas's expression softened slightly. My father used to say that anything worth doing gets complicated eventually. Simple means you're not pushing hard enough. They returned to Blackthorn Ridge 2 days later, and Elena felt something shift as they crossed back through the narrow pass into the valley. This place had felt like a prison when she first arrived. Beautiful, but foreign. A gilded cage she'd traded herself into. Now it felt like something else. Not quite home yet, but maybe the possibility of home. The workers greeted them with relief bordering on celebration. Mrs. Chen had kept operations running during the injunction, but everyone had been anxious about the future. News of the judge's ruling spread fast, and with it came renewed energy. Silas threw himself into spring preparations with intensity that Elena was beginning to recognize as his way of processing stress. He was planning expansion, not Margaret's destructive version, but careful growth that wouldn't compromise sustainability. Two of the investors, Webb and Coughlin, had indeed reached out with proposals for partnerships that aligned with Blackthorn Ridge's values rather than trying to change them. Elena found her own role expanding in ways she hadn't expected. The workers who'd been cautious around her at first now sought her input on practical matters. Housing improvements, supply management, resolving conflicts that arose in close-quarters living. She wasn't trying to be their friend or their boss, just someone who listened and tried to find solutions that actually worked. One afternoon, about a month after the hearing, she was in the communal dining hall reviewing supply lists with James when Marie came running in, excitement bright on her face. "Letter for you, Elena, from Silver Peak." Elena's heart jumped. She'd written to Rosie weekly, but heard back only twice. Mail routes to remote mining towns were unreliable at best. She took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Rosie's handwriting was familiar, the letters carefully formed the way their mother had taught. Elena read quickly, then slower, then had to sit down. Papa died 3 weeks ago. Peaceful, the doctor said, and he wasn't in pain at the end. The medicine you sent, that Silas sent, it helped him breathe easier those last months. He wanted you to know he was proud of what you did for us, even though it meant you had to leave. Samuel's doing well. He's attending the school regularly now that we can afford it, and the teacher says he's bright. I'm working at the general store. They needed help with accounts, and Mrs. Yakamura recommended me. We're managing, Elena. We're actually managing, and it's because of what you did. I know you must feel guilty for not being here, but please don't. Papa understood why you made the choice you made. He told me the night before he died that you were the strongest person he'd ever known, and that he was sorry he put you in a position where you had to use that strength to save us. Come visit when you can. I want to hear about Blackthorn Ridge and your new life. I want to know if that man you married turned out to be worth the sacrifice. And I want to see if you're happy, or at least if you're on your way to being happy. I love you. Samuel loves you. Papa loved you until the end. Your sister, Rosie. Elena read it 3 times before the tears came, and when they did, she couldn't stop them. Relief and grief tangled together. Relief that her father had died peacefully, that her siblings were thriving, that the sacrifice had been worth it. Grief that she hadn't been there, that she'd never see her father again, that the price of her family's survival had been so high. Marie hovered anxiously nearby. Should I get Mr. Granger? No. Yes. I don't know. Elena wiped her face with shaking hands. But Silas appeared anyway. Apparently someone had already fetched him. And for once he didn't ask questions, just sat beside her and waited while she tried to pull herself together. My father died, she managed finally. 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry. Silas's voice was quiet. Do you need to go to Silver Peak for the funeral, or... There's no funeral to attend. It's already done. Elena folded the letter carefully. But I want to visit. See Rosie and Samuel. Make sure they're really okay. Then we'll go. As soon as you're ready. They made the trip 2 weeks later, bringing supplies and gifts that probably looked absurd in Silver Peak's rough context. Elena felt strange riding into the mining town in expensive traveling clothes, accompanied by a husband whose wealth was impossible to hide. Rosie met them at the cabin, their cabin, though it looked different now. Repaired, weatherproofed, the roof fixed where it had been failing. Inside, the shelves were stocked, firewood was piled neatly, and Samuel looked healthy in a way that made Elena's chest ache. Her sister hugged her fiercely. "You look different." "I am different." Elena pulled back to study Rosie, seeing her own changes reflected. "You do too. Older, maybe? Being responsible for a 9-year-old will do that." Rosie's expression turned serious as she looked at Silas. "You're the one who married my sister." "I am." Silas met her gaze without flinching. "Rosie," Elena started. "Are you treating her well?" Rosie interrupted. "Because I meant what I said. If you hurt her, I'll find a way to make you regret it." "I'm treating her fairly," Silas said, "and she's more than capable of defending herself if I don't." Rosie studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fair enough. Come inside. Samuel wants to show Elena his schoolwork." They spent 3 days in Silver Peak, and Elena saw firsthand how the money had changed her family's trajectory. Samuel was thriving in school, already reading better than Elena had at his age. Rosie had found purpose in her work and was saving money with careful discipline. They'd even started talking about the future in ways that didn't involve just surviving day to day. "We might move to Denver eventually," Rosie said on their last evening. "Mrs. Yakamura knows someone who runs a business school for women, says I might have a future in accounting if I get proper training." "You should do it." Elena meant it. "You're too smart to stay in Silver Peak forever." "What about you?" Rosie asked. "Are you happy at Blackthorn Ridge, or are you just managing?" Elena thought about that carefully. "I'm not sure happiness was ever the goal, but I'm finding purpose, which might be better. And Silas is—" She paused, trying to find the right words. "He's honorable, fair. The arrangement works." "That sounds lonely." "Maybe. But it's stable, and stable is something I never had before." Elena looked out at the mountains that had defined her childhood. "I'm learning that sometimes stable is enough. Sometimes it's more than enough." On the ride back to Blackthorn Ridge, Silas was quieter than usual. Finally, as they crossed back through the narrow pass, he spoke. "Your sister asked if the arrangement works. Does it? For you, I mean." Elena considered lying, offering the polite answer that would maintain their careful distance. But they'd built this partnership on honesty, however uncomfortable. "It works better than I expected," she said. "When you first proposed, I thought I was trading myself for my family's survival, and that would be the end of it. I'd live at Blackthorn Ridge as your legal wife and nothing more. But it's become something different. Not a conventional marriage, but not just a transaction either." "What would you call it?" "A collaboration, maybe. We're building something together, even if we didn't plan it that way initially." Elena looked at him directly. "Is that enough for you?" Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My father told me once that love marriages often fail because they're built on feelings that change. But marriages built on mutual respect and shared goals can last because those things are more stable." I didn't understand what he meant until now. "Are you saying you respect me?" Elena kept her tone light, but the question mattered more than she wanted to admit. "I'm saying you're the most formidable person I've met, and partnering with you has made Blackthorn Ridge stronger. So yes, I respect you considerably." It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was honest and it was real, and somehow that mattered more. The following months brought changes that reshaped Blackthorn Ridge in ways neither of them had anticipated. Webb and Coughlin's investment came through, funding expansion that allowed them to hire more workers and improve living conditions without compromising sustainability. Governor Baxter visited personally to discuss using Blackthorn Ridge as a model for responsible resource management, which brought political visibility that protected them from future challenges. Margaret made one final attempt to undermine them, spreading rumors in Denver about Elena's unsuitability and Silas's poor judgment. But the rumors fell flat because Elena had proven herself too thoroughly. The women who'd dismissed her at the governor's reception now invited her to charity events and social gatherings, Curious about the woman who'd stood up to Margaret Granger and won, Elena navigated Denver society with growing confidence, learning to use the platform she'd been given. She advocated for better working conditions across Colorado's resource industries, speaking from personal experience about what poverty actually looked like and what real help required. Some people dismissed her as naive. Others listened. At Blackthorn Ridge itself, Elena found herself managing more than just household operations. Workers brought her problems that Silas's authority couldn't solve: family conflicts, personal crises, situations that required empathy rather than business logic. She mediated disputes, helped families in trouble, and slowly built a network of relationships that made the community stronger. Silas watched all of this with something approaching amazement. "You're better at the human side of operations than I am," he admitted one evening. "I can manage logistics and business strategy, but people's personal problems have always been outside my skill set." "That's because you think of problems as things to solve with logic," Elena said. "But people aren't logical. They're complicated and emotional, and they need someone who understands that survival isn't just about money and resources. It's about dignity and connection, too." "Is that what you needed when I first came to your cabin? Dignity and connection?" Elena thought back to that storm-torn night, to the stranger who'd offered her an impossible bargain. "I needed survival. Everything else came later, and only because you gave me the space to build it myself rather than trying to dictate what my life should look like." It was the closest they'd come to discussing the evolution of their relationship, and Silas seemed to recognize the significance. "I made assumptions when I first sought you out," he said quietly, "about what you needed, what you'd accept, how you'd fit into Blackthorn Ridge. I was wrong about most of it. You've exceeded every expectation." "Is that your way of saying I surprised you?" "Constantly." He almost smiled. "You're nothing like what I thought I was getting." "Neither are you." Elena returned the almost smile. "I thought I was marrying a rough drifter who happened to have money hidden away. Instead, I got a workaholic perfectionist with sustainability obsessions and terrible communication skills." "Terrible?" "You express more emotion about proper forest management than you do about anything involving actual humans." Silas considered that. "Fair assessment." They sat in comfortable silence, and Elena realized this was what they'd built. Not romance, but partnership. Not passion, but mutual respect deep enough to withstand Margaret's attacks and Denver society's judgment and all the complications that came with merging two completely different worlds. 2 years after their marriage, Elena received word that Rosie had been accepted to the business school in Denver and wanted Elena's help getting settled. She traveled to the city with Silas, and they spent a week helping Rosie establish herself in a boarding house that was safe and affordable. Samuel came too, curious about the city and shy around Silas, until Elena explained that her husband was just awkward, not unfriendly. By the end of the week, Samuel was following Silas around asking questions about timber operations and sustainable forestry, and Silas was answering with more patience than Elena had known he possessed. "He's good with your brother," Rosie observed as they watched Silas explain something technical while Samuel listened with rapt attention. "I didn't expect that." "He's good with people who are genuinely interested in what he cares about," Elena said. "It's the social performance he can't stand." "Are you happy?" Rosie asked suddenly. "Really happy, not just managing." Elena thought about Blackthorn Ridge, the valley that had felt like a prison and gradually become something closer to home. Thought about Silas and their strange partnership built on honesty rather than romance. Thought about the work she'd found and the purpose she'd discovered in helping others navigate the same kind of desperation she'd once known. "I'm not sure happiness is the right word," she said slowly, "but I'm satisfied, I'm useful, I'm building something that matters. That's more than I ever thought I'd have." "That sounds like happiness to me," Rosie said. "Just a different kind than the stories promise." Maybe she was right. Maybe happiness didn't have to be romance and passion and all the things fairy tales claimed it should be. Maybe it could be partnership and purpose and the quiet satisfaction of building something sustainable. Back at Blackthorn Ridge, life continued its rhythms: spring planting, summer growth, fall harvest, winter preparation. Elena learned the patterns, found her place within them, and gradually stopped feeling like an outsider pretending to belong. 3 years after the wedding, Silas came to her room late one evening, unusual enough that Elena immediately tensed. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," The opposite, actually. He stood in her doorway like he wasn't sure he should enter. I've been reviewing the partnership agreements we made with Webb and Coughlin. They want to expand the collaboration, bring in additional sustainable operations across Colorado. It would mean traveling more, representing Blackthorn Ridge at negotiations and planning sessions. That sounds good. You've been pushing for that kind of regional cooperation. I want you to do it with me. Not as my wife providing social legitimacy, but as an equal partner in the negotiations. Silas met her eyes. You understand the human cost of unsustainable practices better than anyone I know. The investors respect you after how you handled Margaret, and frankly, I trust your judgment on whether partnerships will actually benefit workers versus just benefiting owners. Elena felt something shift in her chest, recognition, maybe, of how far they'd come from that storm-torn cabin. Equal partners? In business, yes. In life? He paused, seeming to choose words carefully. We've built something here that works. It's not conventional, but it's real. I'd like to acknowledge that formally. Not change the arrangement. I know you value your autonomy, but recognize that this partnership has become more than either of us initially planned. What does that mean practically? It means I'm asking if you want to truly share Blackthorn Ridge's future. Not just live here as my legal wife, but actively shape what we become. Build something together that's stronger than what either of us could create alone. Elena thought about the girl who'd opened her cabin door to a dangerous stranger during a storm. That girl had been desperate, trapped, willing to sacrifice herself for her family's survival. She'd seen marriage as the price of that survival, nothing more. But the woman standing here now had learned something important, that sometimes transactions evolve into partnerships, and partnerships can become something worth choosing actively rather than accepting reluctantly. Yes, she said simply. I want to build something together. Silas smiled, a real smile, rare enough to be remarkable. Good, because I've realized that what I thought I needed when I came to Silver Peak, a legal wife for inheritance purposes, was far less valuable than what I actually found. A partner who challenges me, strengthens Blackthorn Ridge, and refuses to be diminished by people like Margaret. You're getting sentimental in your old age, Elena said, but she was smiling too. Practical, not sentimental, acknowledging value when I see it. Same thing sometimes. They stood in her doorway, neither quite crossing the threshold, but both acknowledging that something had shifted. The careful distance they'd maintained since the wedding was still there. Elena still had her own room. They still operated with formal boundaries, but beneath it was something newer. Partnership had become companionship, and companionship was growing into something that might eventually be called love, though neither of them would rush to name it. 5 years after the wedding, Blackthorn Ridge had become a model for sustainable resource management across the Western Territories. Elena traveled frequently to speak about workers' rights and practical poverty solutions, using her platform to push for changes that would have helped her family years earlier. Silas expanded operations carefully, always prioritizing long-term stability over short-term profit. Margaret made peace eventually, or at least stopped actively fighting. Her investors had moved on to other opportunities, and the governor's support for Blackthorn Ridge's methods had made opposition politically unwise. She still attended family events with barely concealed disapproval, but she'd learned to keep her opinions to herself. Rosie graduated from business school and started her own accounting firm in Denver, specifically serving small businesses and miners' families who couldn't afford traditional accountants. Samuel went east for university. Geology, he said, because he wanted to understand mountains better than their father had. And Elena found herself standing in the valley one spring morning, watching workers prepare for the season, feeling something she'd never expected to feel about Blackthorn Ridge: belonging. Silas found her there, as he often did when she needed space to think. Regrets? He asked quietly. Elena considered the question honestly. She'd traded her freedom for her family's survival, married a stranger, walked into a world that had no reason to accept her. She'd fought Margaret's challenges, navigated Denver society, built a life from nothing but determination and the slim opportunity Silas's offer had provided. I regret that I had to make the choice I made, she said finally. I regret that poverty forced me into a situation where selling myself in marriage was the best option available. But I don't regret what I built from that choice. don't regret partnering with you or finding purpose here or becoming someone strong enough to fight for what matters. Good. Silas stood beside her, looking out at the valley they'd protected together. Because I don't regret it either. I thought I needed a wife for legal purposes and got someone who transformed Blackthorn Ridge into something better than I could have achieved alone. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching spring return to the mountains. What had begun as a desperate transaction in a storm-battered cabin had evolved into something neither of them had planned, but both had chosen to nurture. Not the romance that stories promised, but something more durable, partnership built on honesty, respect earned through challenge, and the quiet satisfaction of building something worth protecting. Elena thought about the girl she'd been, desperate, trapped, willing to trade herself for survival. That girl would barely recognize the woman standing here now, confident in her choices and clear about her worth. The journey between those two versions of herself had been painful, complicated, and entirely worth it. Sometimes strength came from surviving impossible situations. Sometimes it came from choosing to build something meaningful from the wreckage of desperate choices. And sometimes, if you were lucky, it came from finding a partner who respected your strength enough to help you build it into something even greater. Blackthorn Ridge stood behind them, sustainable and thriving, proof that long-term thinking could triumph over short-term greed. Ahead lay years of work, challenges they couldn't yet imagine, and the slow evolution of partnership into something deeper. But for now, in this moment, Elena was exactly where she needed to be, standing beside someone who'd offered her survival and inadvertently given her the space to discover that she was capable of so much more than merely surviving. She'd become someone who thrived, and that made every difficult choice along the way worthwhile.